Hello, everyone. Welcome. We'll give folks a few seconds here to get connected and logged in. But we're glad you're here today for our next installment of Courageous Conversations.
Oh, I forgot I was going to find some music to play. All right. You can put your recommendations in the chat, and I'll get that for next time.
A weirdo.
Susan. I was proud of myself because I hadn't really looked at how to share a computer sound, but then I went into advanced. I'm like, it's kind of fun. I'll go ahead and start screen sharing.
Yeah, we can go ahead and get started, I think.
Okay, and just to make sure I'm in presentation mode. Are you seeing the full screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so welcome again, everyone, to our March Courageous Conversations, pro or against choice. We're talking about women's reproductive rights and healthcare today and some of the history with that. We have a special guest speaker that I'll introduce a little bit later, but to start, our organizers and leaders for Courageous Conversations are Reverend Ernestine Flemister of St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Grants Pass, Reverend Tom Berry of Bethany Presbyterian Church, myself, Reverend Ryan Scott at Newman United Methodist Church, Jenny Jackson, who is RCC adjunct faculty, and she is not with us today. And of course, Sally Snyder, the RCC coordinator of diversity programming. So our objectives is to, number one, is to discuss systemic oppression. Number two, we're here to create an awareness of our local history with racism and other forms of prejudice. Number three, to expand our circle of knowledge. Number four, to create community accountability. Number five, to network with people who are different than us. And six, to share and spread new ideas. 7, to generate a community of caring and mutual respect. 8, to give us courage. I'm going to go over some conversation ground rules here to create a safe space for us to learn, share, and grow with one another. One of our first tenets for our ground rules is open-mindedness, to listen to all points of view and be curious. Acceptance, suspend judgment as best you can. Respect, we're here to seek to understand rather than to persuade or convert. And discovery, question your old assumptions and look for new insights. Brevity, go for honesty and depth, but don't go on and on. Sincerity, speak only for yourself about what has personal meaning to you. And just a quick side note along those ground rules, I know that today's topic can be contentious in some circles and has a history of sparking robust debate. And here at Courageous Conversations, we welcome all points of view and all opinions. We also understand that some of you may want to share those opinions anonymously. So if you would like to share opinions or questions anonymously, you are welcome to do so in the chat. Just make sure you are chatting with one of our Courageous Conversations leaders, with Sally, myself, or Tom and Ernestine, and we can relay your question to the group anonymously. Any questions before we begin? Okay, with that, I will introduce our guest speaker presenter today, the Reverend Melissa Harkness, she, her. Melissa is an ordained elder in the Oregon, Idaho Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. She is currently serving as a pastor on staff at Ascension Lutheran Church in Medford, and will soon be serving as pastor at, was it Cherry Park and Epworth United Methodist Churches in the Portland area. So we're grateful for Melissa to be here today. She has history working with Planned Parenthood and issues around women's reproductive rights, and we are glad that Melissa is with us today. So with that, Melissa, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. I noticed from Matthew that you're hearing impaired. Is there something I can do to make myself heard better? Can everyone hear me okay? I just want to make sure. Okay. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Thank you. So it's a great privilege to be here and share this courageous conversation with you today. As a woman and a spiritual leader, as a former community educator with Planned Parenthood, and especially as a mother of a teenage daughter, the topic of reproductive health is near and dear to my heart. But I do want to acknowledge that as a white cisgendered woman, I have never personally had difficulty accessing reproductive health care. So I don't speak from a place of experience, but I do speak from a place of passion, and I value your time and conversation in this place. So the topic of reproductive health care conjures up healthcare around women specifically, and this is Women's History Month, and so that's part of why this topic came up. But as we get started, I want to remind folks that reproductive health care is not gender specific. Different bodies have different needs, right? And with that said, I will largely focus my attention on the importance of reproductive health care and the accessibility issues surrounding it. And that's not just women. I just want us to keep that in mind. So what am I talking about when I talk about reproductive health care? I want to define what I'm saying. And you know what? I just realized that I have a whole screen share thing that I didn't even start. So we might want to do that. So let me see if I can get that going.
Looks good. You got it.
Okay. So there's this guy. We'll get to him in a moment. So the topic of reproductive health care, when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of illness and disease, but in all matters relating to the reproductive system and its functions and processes. So that might include preventing and treating sexually transmitted infections, including HIV and AIDS. It might mean bringing patients into the healthcare system and encouraging diagnosis and treatment of other diseases and conditions, cancers of reproductive organs, for instance. It includes maternal health, family planning, comprehensive sexuality education, abortion services. Those are all under the umbrella of reproductive health care. But I want to start with a little history surrounding reproductive health care, because we'll see that racism was built into the system from the very beginning. I'll start with this guy, James Marion Sims. He's considered the father of modern gynecology, and his practices really set a precedent for healthcare, reproductive healthcare. He was a 19th century plantation slave owner that did some medical school back when the standards weren't all that high to become a doctor. Okay. He developed really pioneering tools that are still used and surgical techniques for women's healthcare specifically, back in a time when women's healthcare in general was a taboo subject. He was named president of the American Medical Association in 1876, and in 1880, he became the president of the American Gynecological Society, an organization that he helped found. But his research was largely conducted on enslaved Black women on his plantation and without anesthesia. He caused untold suffering by operating under the racist notion that Black people did not feel pain. So his use of enslaved Black bodies as medical test subjects falls into a long, ethically bereft history that includes things such as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Anyone familiar with that? So there was this experiment in 1932, and in order to track a disease's full progression, researchers didn't care for their African-American participants who experienced or who had syphilis. And so they experienced all the problems that went along with that. And it also includes the history of folks like Henrietta Lacks. She died of cervical cancer, but before she died, they took cells from her tumor and put them in a petri dish without her consent. And they were the first time that they were able to keep human cells alive in a culture for decades for research. They still exist today. Her cells reproduced an entire generation every 24 hours. And so her cells were harvested and reproduced without consent. And many people today have benefited from the studies of her cells. So in 1916, the idea of Planned Parenthood began at the first birth control clinic in Brooklyn, in Brownsville, New York, the Brownsville Clinic in Brooklyn. And while today it works to provide low-cost reproductive health care to folks regardless of gender or economic or race, it also has racism as a part of its history. Both the field of gynecology and the world's leader in reproductive health care has had racism built into its core. So Planned Parenthood traces its roots back to a nurse named Margaret Sanger. She was a nurse on the Lower East Side of New York, and she grew up in this huge Irish family of 11 children. And she watched her mom's health decline after her mom gave birth to these 11 children, and she also had 7 miscarriages, and her mom died at the age of 50. So her mother's story, along with her work as a nurse on the Lower East Side, inspired her to kind of travel Europe and study birth control methods at a time when educating people about birth control was illegal in the United States. So on October 16th, 1960, Margaret Sanger, together with her sister, Ethel, and an activist named Fania Mindell, opened the country's first birth control clinic in Brooklyn. And women lined up and down the block to get birth control information and advice. But 9 days later, the police raided it and shut it down and jailed them all. And Margaret refused to pay a fine. So she spent 30 days in jail, and she educated inmates while she was there about birth control methods. But although it was shut down, she went on to travel the country, share her vision. But there were flaws with her vision because she largely, she believed in the principle of eugenics. So eugenics is this inherently racist and ableist ideology that labeled certain people unfit to have children. So eugenics is this theory that society can be improved through planned breeding for desirable traits like intelligence or industriousness. And for the many contributions Sanger made towards accessing reproductive health care, she also created a system that discriminated against women of color from the beginning, because the eugenics was mostly a popular ideology among educated white men and women, and being a person of color was not a desirable trait. Okay, so today, Planned Parenthood denounces the history and legacy of its anti-Blackness in gynecology and the reproductive rights movement and the mistreatment that there is mistreatment that continues of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in this country. So while reproductive health care is more than contraception and abortion, in history, you could see immediate effects when the birth control pill became available in 1960. Access to the pill improved things like education rates, wages, and helped women get out of poverty. Women gained access to the pill through laws that allowed women who weren't married to access that pill. And they saw a huge increase in enrollment in college. They saw delayed childbirth. They saw access to they saw a substantial increase of women in the workforce, and they saw a lot of careers in professional fields such as medicine and law. They saw more women. They also saw higher wages, and having access to contraception by the age of 20 reduced the probability that women live in poverty. So it likely It likely impacted women's expectation for their future or their sense of empowerment, which may have contributed to that reduction in poverty. So access to federally funded family planning programs resulted in fewer children in the short and long run, and the reduction of the number of people living in poverty as adults. With that said, that access was still limited to certain people. And there is still a lack of access to reproductive health care for Black, Indigenous, people of color in this country. Key barriers to access are negative attitudes of providers in society, a lack of trained providers, assumptions and inadequate knowledge amongst providers, communication limitations, inaccessible facilities, lack of transportation, high costs of care, unnecessary referrals, and low-income women and women of color can face additional barriers due to the historical and systemic biases in place. There's also a historic distrust of the malpractice that has been built into our system. Now, sexual and reproductive health care can be a sensitive topic, and this can make it difficult to access information and services around sexual and reproductive health, especially in places where religious and cultural beliefs restrict access to contraception and abortion. And for many women, the lack of access to these family planning services means they are unable to choose when they have children and how many children they have. I, stopped doing my thing. I'm sorry. So we'll get here in a minute. I, got into it. I forgot to move my slideshow. I think I was saying for many women, the lack of access to these family planning services means they're unable to choose when they have children and how many children they have. And it's often the poorest who can't access these services. And therefore, this lack of planning can have a huge financial impact on women and their families. And this can impact their health as well as the health of their family. Consequences can be wide-ranging, from child malnutrition to the inability to send the children to school. And a lack of sexual and reproductive health service can also lead to the spread of sexually transmitted infections for all sexually active people. This directly impacts the health and well-being and livelihood of families, and can be particularly dangerous for those if an infection has those with an infection that have not been able to access health services to diagnose or treat their illness. The lack of gender-affirming healthcare adds a whole new wrinkle. More than 19 million people of reproductive age living in the US are in need of publicly funded contraception, and they live in what is called a contraceptive desert. Living in a contraceptive desert means that they lack reasonable access in their county to a health center that offers the full range of contraceptive methods. About 1.2 million of these people live in a county without a single healthcare center offering the full range of methods. And for all these people, getting contraception means having to do more than showing up to an appointment. They have to find a babysitter or take time off of work or travel a long distance to access their preferred birth control method. They're not alone. In fact, we have kind of one of those deserts here in Oregon, a couple of them. One of those deserts happens between Medford and Eugene. The Roseburg area does not have a lot of options, okay? We know that there are women across the US who aren't eligible for publicly funded contraception, but still rely on the same health centers. Whether for convenience or privacy reasons or instances of reproductive coercion, women who have insurance may still seek contraception at health centers that primarily serve low-income women. It only tells a part of the story to say that 19 million women live in contraceptive deserts. So in 1970, there was a Title X was created to provide affordable birth control and reproductive health care to people with low incomes who couldn't otherwise afford these services on their own. Federal federal Title X funding was intended to ensure that everyone, regardless of where they live, how much money they make, their background, or whether or not they have health insurance, has access to basic preventative reproductive health care. Prior to 2016, 4 million people a year relied on the reproductive health care services that were provided through Title X. And many of those folks didn't know that existed, but the primary and preventative services provided by Title X included wellness exams, cervical and breast cancer screenings, birth control, contraception, education and testing, treatment for sexually transmitted infections, and HIV testing. In 2019, the Trump administration implemented a Title X gag rule. And so that what happened is that rule banned doctors in the Title X program from across the country from telling people how they could safely and legally access abortion. So this prohibited nurses and doctors from giving people full information about all their sexual and reproductive health care options. This new rule forced many providers, such as Planned Parenthood, to withdraw from the Title X program, and it slashed the program's National Family Planning Network's patient capacity by half. Because of racism, homophobia, transphobia, and other systemic barriers that contribute to income inequality, people of color and LGBTQ plus people in rural areas make up a large proportion of those who rely on Title X funding. And for people of color, the right to bodily autonomy and quality healthcare has been consistently under attack in this country, leading to huge disparities in sexual and reproductive health outcomes between women of color and white women. And by undermining Title X, the Trump administration limited healthcare options even further and worsened massive inequalities that have long existed in American society. So before we go into conversation, I do want to say, I don't know if people have seen the news recently that Mackenzie Scott, ex-wife of Jeff Bezos, recently made a $247 million donation to Planned Parenthood nationwide. And our two of our affiliates here in Oregon, the Columbia Willamette, which is the Portland area down to south to Salem, and the Southwest Oregon Planned Parenthood will be beneficiaries of large donations, about $15 million, which will largely help recoup some of the lost funding from Title X. And a statement put out by the Planned Parenthood of Columbia Willamette said that most of that will go towards education and increasing access to healthcare, especially to vulnerable populations that continue to see barriers accessing that. So that's a little bit of history, and I wanted to give you some history. I also wanted to give you some information here of where you can access healthcare locally, reproductive healthcare, how to make an appointment. These are just a few of the places that offer stuff in Southern Oregon. And then I wanted to list just where I got some of my some good online resources. This first website listed here, Abortion's Welcome, is brand new. And it is a website that provides spiritual resources for those pondering, those in the midst of, or those who have had an abortion. So it's a brand new thing for spiritual support. The Oregon Reproductive Health Program also has an Instagram presence and a phone number that you can dial, 211, or if you want to text health or salud in Spanish, it'll pop up and show you your closest reproductive health care clinic. Okay, and then some other great resources. And then if you're interested in learning more about Margaret Sanger, she did write a autobiography. Oh, I just hit something. She did do an autobiography, which she's not the best writer in the world, but it gives you a full picture of that. and some other historical resources if you want to learn about any of these folks that I talked about. But I mostly want to now move in and have some conversation around reproductive health care and the barriers. Did people learn any new information? I spoke fast. Did I speak too fast?
I think you were great.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was nervous. I'm glad to be here, but I still get nervous.
We're very glad to have you. So we're kind of opening things up to the full room here for any questions or clarifications or points of interest you would like to share or have conversation on. If you want to speak, I just ask that you go ahead and raise your hand, although we're somewhat smaller than usual group today, so we may not need to raise hands. We might be able to just...
I think I see a hand. Susan?
Susan? Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Hi, I'm the resource coordinator for Rogue Community College, and I've been actively putting together a new resources page for the RCC website. And in my work here, I've also met online on Zoom someone from the Josephine County Health Department. So we were having a conversation yesterday about what could we put on the website as a resource, and we talked specifically about someone had contacted her from Planned Parenthood, and knowing the situation in the community with Planned Parenthood and my own experiences at the farmers market, the growers market, I just really don't want that attention drawn to the RCC website. So I'm opting not to have a link to Planned Parenthood or that sort of thing on there. Sadly, I'd love to have that on there, but I feel like I don't want that kind of attention drawn to RCC. So do you have any comments on that? Should I be braver or what's the conversation there?
Yeah, so Planned Parenthood, when people hear Planned Parenthood, they have image of abortion and protesters. I mean, that's just a huge thing that people think of with Planned Parenthood. That's only about 6% of what Planned Parenthood does. And it's unfortunate that that's how they are seen. But I think one thing that's important, I can't tell you what's right for RCC and as far as drawing attention, because we live in an area of the country where there is a lot of dissension. But I think it's important that people educate others, knowing that a huge part of what Planned Parenthood does is education, and the largest thing they do is screen for cancers, screen for cancers and treat sexually transmitted infections and provide birth control. So that's the bulk of what they do. It's hard, I'm always a proponent of saying, yes, go for it. But I also know that there's negative around that.
I'm going to encourage you, Susan, and we can talk more later, but we need to be on the forefront of education and offering resources to folks. And that's something that's going to keep our students being able to come here, is to being able to access the healthcare they need in all forms. And there's, we can talk more offline, but I'm going to say strong vote for yes, absolutely provide the resources.
Yeah, I just think the education piece is a key. I think there's a misunderstanding sometimes.
Ernestine, you're raising your hand.
Yes, I did. I just wanted to say I would, yes, encourage you to provide the information, because I think we live in a society now where you are intimidated by people who are trying to force their opinions on everybody else. You give the information and it's a choice. And I don't, we seem to have a problem with choice. You're not actually telling people to do it. You're saying, here's the information, you make your decision and you make your choice. And I think by allowing people to do that, we encourage open conversation within families and within groups. And I think it's wrong of us to allow people to silence us, which is essentially what would be happening. To say, no, you can't do this because you're afraid that they will come for you, as the expression goes. But yeah, they make a lot of noise at the growers market, but most of the time they're ignored, and you go about your business and you do what you need to do. And I think that we need to have that courageous stance, like, this is what we stand for, and we're gonna stick by it.
It can be, I mean, there's a difference between being uncomfortable and then fearing for your safety. And I really don't know the climate enough at RCC. Grant, you're on the Grants Pass campus? Or just, are you talking about RCC in general?
RCC in general, because
Okay.
this will go out to all 3 campuses. And the climate here on the on the Redwood campus is quiet. There's hardly anybody here, at least right now.
And I would guess it would stay that way. I mean, there are already protesters down by RCC campus in Medford because Planned Parenthood is right around the corner. We are not even a block from the campus down there. So they're already experiencing that in the area.
This is August. I just wanted to let you all know that we actually already do on our community resource page that the counselors had put together, that now Susan is giving us some of her time to be able to continue to update. Planned Parenthood is already listed on an Ashland and Grants Pass in Medford. And I do agree with what Sally had said, you know, that we need to provide students with options.
Yeah, and Tammy suggests that we put other pregnancy support options on there, maybe even more conservative, to kind of balance it out. I mean, I know that there is the pregnancy, I just blanked what they're called, pregnancy.
I believe it's pregnancy care.
Pregnancy care. They have a van that they'll park out and talk to folks. And I know that they have a big presence here in Medford. I'm not sure about Grants Pass. And I saw that the concept of eugenics. If you want to reduce the number of people of color, why not provide them contraception? Yeah, seems that would further the agenda. Not to say that I support it, just confused by the lack of logic. It wasn't logical. But it was seen that white people had more desirable features in general. And it was also understood that they were more intelligent, which is false. But so they wanted to just breed certain traits and not let other people breed at all. Yeah.
Conchetta?
I'm curious, what was Sanger's position about providing birth control to the immigrant population, which was so big at that time in Brooklyn?
Yeah, there wasn't their clinics served immigrant populations, and as a nurse, she worked with immigrant populations, so she didn't have trouble providing that for them. They probably had other barriers, but her pregnancy, the first birth control clinic was in a largely immigrant area in Brooklyn. Yeah.
I have one other question. I'm wondering about Planned Parenthood's outreach to cognitively challenged adults or developmentally disabled, because I think that that's a really underserved population, and we sort of ignore the fact that folks with those challenges are sexual beings.
I agree. And I think that's still a growing edge. At least in Southwest Oregon, I was a part of the community educator program. And that was a largely underserved population, and it still is. But no, I agree. That, and surprisingly, older adults. We were just starting to develop curriculum for older adults, which just blew my mind when I got there, that there wasn't already discussions and curriculum and programs for older adults. It was a very specific population that was targeted. I'm hoping with these donations and as the education program grows and they can hire more educators, that I know that there was talk about having educators that had specialties, so that this educator would work with older adults. This one would work with teens. This one would work with folks that are incarcerated. And I know when they dropped Title X funding, and then with the pandemic, that's when I lost my position as a community educator, because they just couldn't afford having folks with specialties. They went down to a couple educators, and it's all online now. And it's directed mostly for middle schoolers and high schoolers. Yeah.
Well, I have a question I'd like to pose to the group. Do you believe that there are cultural barriers to reproductive health care in our community? Or maybe a better way to put it would be, what are the cultural barriers to reproductive health care in our community? I'm thinking of Southwest Oregon in particular.
Define cultural.
Systems in our area that perpetuate this lack of access, be that religious beliefs or political beliefs, or yeah, that kind of.
Well, then I would say the church is probably one of the major cultural barriers in this area.
I think it was Susan who mentioned the growers market, the protesters there. That I've been bullied by them actually coming out of a church that had nothing to do. I mean, I don't know why they were there in the first place. But they're scary. They're bullying people. And so by standing outside of places to access healthcare, it's really scary.
Were folks aware? I had a conversation with the presenters, but were folks aware that the Grants Pass Clinic just reopened after being closed for months? The Planned Parenthood, they were vandalized, and the people were threatened, and they had rocks thrown through the windows, and it was kind of a big thing, and they had to shut down from November until they just reopened a couple weeks ago. So there's really is kind of a feeling of a security threat sometimes. I think it's largely due to religious beliefs. I've also seen, I mean, I don't want to take over this conversation, it's for all of us, but sometimes in Latinx culture, emphasis on large families and religious belief also make it a unique challenge as far as education and just providing access in a way that is culturally sensitive.
So I worked for Planned Parenthood for 11 years in California. And I agree everything you said, Melissa, and the cultural. We were large Hispanic population, and the amount of the wives that kind of snuck into the clinic so that their partner, husband, family was unaware that they were coming in to get birth control was huge. The conversations were huge in regards to the reproductive rights.
Mhm.
And so it was an amazing opportunity to educate and to be there for them as a woman. And it was also discouraging that they had to be so behind the scenes, try to get into the clinic to take care of themselves. So yes, Ryan, absolutely. The cultural, our Hispanic population is growing here in our area, and I've not worked or been involved with Planned Parenthood since I've moved up here to Oregon. But absolutely, it is a issue, if you will.
And I would say another huge issue is lack of gender affirming care for those who are non-binary or trans, or and just the lack of knowledge and understanding first on how to treat folk, just the assumptions that come with reproductive health care, but also even as simple as things like not honoring a person's name that they've chosen, like that they have, a new name, by having dead names on medical charts. A dead name, is everyone familiar with that concept? Right. So sometimes folks will transition, whatever that looks like, and they will have a new name. And a dead name is one that they may have been born with, but they no longer use. But a medical chart, people won't honor that, and they'll call them by their dead name, which can cause trauma to folks who are trying to access healthcare. So I think culturally, we have a long ways to go as far as gender affirming care in general, not just Southern Oregon.
One thing that always baffled me was that there are still doctors out there practicing who will refuse a woman's choice, even if it's a medical necessity, for things like birth control, sterilization procedures, even because, oh, well, you'll want kids, or I have to talk to a male in your family first before I'll even talk to you about this particular topic. It's like, in this day and age, that's still a thing. It's just disturbing.
I actually had that experience now that you mention it. I needed a hysterectomy, but a male doctor refused to do that because I was still childbearing age.
Wow.
Even though I had issues that I needed to have a hysterectomy.
Yeah, just such a blatant double standard, because I'm sure I could, even at my young age, I could still call my doctor right now and schedule a procedure if I needed to or wanted to.
Yeah. Pregnancy center, thank you. Yeah.
Another question for us to think about a little bit. I was kind of wondering, talking about all this, how different our community might be, or how different our community would be if people could easily and readily have access to holistic reproductive health care. What kind of a change might we see in our community and our healthcare system if that were true? Or maybe that can be a question we all just ponder on our own.
I'll say one quick thing in response to that, Ryan, which is that the question itself just makes me sad, because my first reaction is that it strikes me as such fantasy. and it shouldn't strike me as fantasy. So my gut reaction to that question was very sobering to me. Thank you for raising it.
Yeah, I think it's helpful for us to, even if it does seem like fantasy when it shouldn't, it's helpful to dream or to vision what things could be. And it gives us that motivation to keep advocating for change and for progress when it comes to reproductive health care.
I'll say too that I think that if that was, manifested where everybody could have access to good health care, reproductive health care in particular, on demand, it would change how people feel about themselves. And that would in turn change the tone of intimidation that we were talking about before. And I think there would be lots of positive effects that would ripple out.
Absolutely.
Something, if you've talked to me on the topic of abortion, you probably heard me say this, that I don't think abortion is the problem. The problem is an unwanted pregnancy. And that is the issue I wish people would focus on. There's preventative measures, of course. So a lot of times people who are against one thing, they're also against contraception, and we need to be realistic, and contraception is really important. But then on the other side of that, if somebody does have a pregnancy that they're not able to support, one of the reasons might be because they're going to have to drop out of school. They're not going to be able to support the child, what have you. So put your time and your money into providing resources for this woman and this child to be able to have the child. It's so painful to watch a woman who's already in a very difficult place, scary place, to be persecuted when we should be supporting each other on either side of it.
Well, I think it goes to the deeper question of how society views women, and how women are devalued, and in the sense that we're not capable or smart enough to make choices, to know our bodies, and to make choices and decisions for ourselves. And so when you go to the, don't get me started, we go to the issues of control. And when it comes to the vaccine, you see all these signs, but my body, my choice. But when it comes to making a decision about whether you want to get an abortion, it's not your body and your choice anymore. It becomes somebody else's choice to make for your body. And so I think a lot of it has to do with how we think about women, and how we look at women, and how we value women. So there's a lot to unpack before we get to the place where we can say, okay, you get to make the choice and you get to make the decision on your own, as opposed to having somebody else make it for you.
Something else I just noticed as I was listening was the lack of men in this conversation, even just here today. Our group, our group usually leans pretty female heavy, but I'm just listening today that myself and Tom and Gary, I think, are the Matthew was here earlier, are the only males who are here today. And I don't know what that says about our culture, or the commentary on talking about reproductive health care. I think there is like a masculinity in our culture where men just don't want to talk about it at all. We'd rather, that's a women's issue. And as Melissa, as you were talking about early on, it's not just a women's issue. Health care is an everyone issue.
I just can't stress enough the importance of education and having just comprehensive sexuality education. starting fairly young and moving through the whole life spectrum. Well, even as an educator, I learned so much, and I'm in my 40s, and I'm like, what, really? You know, when I joined, and I was surprised that I didn't know, but just arming people with the resources and tools to make good choices is so important. I saw someone came on. Anne?
Oh. I'm kind of thinking back to Ryan's question about culture.
Mhm.
And my grandmother died from a self-induced abortion before abortion was legal. This was in 1936, I think. Anyway, and she died. And so part of the culture around that is that this event was never spoken of in any way by her whole extended family until nearly 100 years later, when a second cousin of mine said, I have the death certificate and I need to tell you what's on it. And I had to tell her, I already know, because my mother had told me what happened. But she had no idea that my mother even knew.
Wow.
So I think part of the issue with a lot of this is the shame. And I really feel like, as you were talking, Melissa, that Planned Parenthood addresses that it's the whole person. It's not like, as you were saying, Sally, necessarily about a procedure. And it is about education, but it's also, as you were saying, Ryan, I think this culture of reinforced shame around that. And I think there's a way through that. It just is a lot of work and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
I wanted to say that when I was growing up in the 1950s, one of the male mythologies was that the ideal wife would be pregnant and barefoot. And I think that dramatically changed in the 1960s when there was more choice in the pill. And I think that movement is constantly battered by religious belief and other mythologies. So thanks.
Yeah, thinking about shame, I don't know if there's there probably isn't any other organization that's done more to produce shame among people than the church throughout history. I know that many of us now in the faith community are trying to overcome that and repent, if you will, of our sins of the past, and try to embrace a culture in a way of faith and spirituality that's not shame-based, but that's more celebrating people's lives and bodies and the holistic faith, including reproductive health care. Anybody have any final questions before our closing comments and announcements?
This isn't really a question. I think where I left off trailing in my story is that there is an intergenerational trauma component to this. Mm-hmm. Like, I have the experience of never having had a grandmother, for instance. And I grew up with a mother who never really had a mother. And it will continue, and it continues on. And so when we're dealing with such a complex issue with so many layers, I think part of what centers us is the intergenerational aspect of this sort of thing. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all so much for sharing and being here today. And a special thank you to you, Melissa, for chatting with us and educating us. We are very grateful for you. Sally, did you want to share about next month's event?
Yes, thank you. I'm going to put in the chat a couple of things. One is a Facebook link to a video, and you don't have to have Facebook to watch it, but it is a speech that Reverend Ryan gave on the courthouse steps for a reproductive rights rally, and it was just so moving. I really encourage you to watch it. It's excellent. Also, I'll give you our next Courageous Conversations. It's going to be in a month on April 26th, and we're going to be discussing voting rights and the history of voting rights and keeping our democracy strong. And then also we have a very short survey. I hope you'll click on that link too and give us some feedback. So thanks everyone for joining us here today. Appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I learned a lot that I didn't know about too. All right. I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great day.